Good evening. I'm Erica Lost. NATO forces bombed Serbia and Kosovo. An unidentified man is being held for questioning by the FBI for suspected links to last month's biological virus deaths. In local news, a dog named Hero takes the grand prize at the annual... I wish I could tell you more pertinent news, but we're in a rating system here, and the key factor is... sensationalism. They've got you running in circles, 9 to 5, then 5 to 9. You're mine. I tell you what they want you to know, and you consider it the truth. Nobody is opening their eyes. Our global economy is depleting the world of our lives and natural resources. And are you happy? Come on! I work for the system.
Well, if you filled up your gas tank lately, then you don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
You don't need us to tell you gas prices are on the rise. I know.
And at 12:09, welcome back in. The final days of the campaign sometimes can get a little salty.
Well, the final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
The final days of the campaign can get a little salty.
As you've probably noticed, the final days of the campaign have been, well, you might call them just a little salty.
If your email inbox is out of control and you've given up sorting it out, a Baltimore company thinks it has a solution for you. Could this be the end of email overload?
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 Could this be the end to email overload?
Could this be the end of email overload?
Could this be the end of email overload?
And welcome back to the show. I scream, you scream. You know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, and you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
If you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face.
Tonight, chewing on free trade. Tonight, market down, book sales up.
Tonight, award-winning style.
Here's the latest from the City Pulse News Team.
Good evening. Our top story tonight, pitching free trade to Ontario's agriculture industry. Canada's ambassador to the United States, Ellen Gottlieb, is in town tonight trying to do just that.
Real people connecting with our audience, drawing from an established nationwide network, all under the Quebecor Media banner. Coast to coast, and as Canadian as you are, Sun News Network, hard news, straight talk, coming soon.
CTV National News with Lloyd Robertson. CTV National News with Lisa Leflam.
Thanks for being with us. I'm Sandy Ronaldo. We'll be here tomorrow, and of course, we hope you'll tune in.
Welcome to E-Talk. I'm Ben Mulrooney.
Good evening. I'm Gord Martineau.
Welcome to CBC News Toronto. I'm Anne-Marie Medaway.
And I'm Dwight Drummond.
Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, Toronto.
I'm Peter Mansbridge. Thanks for watching.
Have you had enough propaganda from the corporate-controlled media? Break free from the mainstream. Join PressForTruth.tv.